It started with my brother's old recipe tin, the dented aluminum box with a red Bakelite lid that my sister-in-law tossed into a donation pile like it was greasy pizza box, and it ended with her standing in a prison-issue apron that read Icing on the fraud. Elbow deep in steaming water at my bakery, every single cent of her court-garnished wages buying pastries for a legal aid fundraiser that helps women escape financial predators. I'm going to walk you through every intricate, sweat-soaked, meticulously documented step of how I proved she forged my signature on a dissolution document, sold my life's work and my brother's legacy out from under me for $620,000, and how I turned that towering betrayal into the sweetest, most calorie-rich revenge the city of Milwaukee has ever seen. This is a story about flour, fraud, and the forensic power of a woman who spent 34 years learning that the devil doesn't just live in the details. He lives in the paper trail. I was a scrub nurse, orthopedic surgery, 3 decades of counting clamps, swabs, and suture needles, with a level of obsessive precision that makes tax auditors look sloppy. My pension, a carefully husbanded $130,000, was my ticket to a quiet retirement after my husband Paul, a gentle architect who designed quiet libraries, died of a stroke a decade earlier. I had no children, just a neat little condo and a fierce love for my younger brother Michael. Michael was the golden one, the one with the flour-dusted apron, and the laugh that could make a room full of strangers feel like they'd just bitten into a warm croissant. He'd spent 20 years as a pastry chef in hotels where the desserts cost more than my weekly grocery bill, and his dream was a historic patisserie in Milwaukee's 3rd Ward, a brick storefront with original tin ceilings and wide windows that caught the morning light. When he asked me to go into business with him and his wife Vanessa, I didn't pause. I liquidated every investment, signed a notarized 50-50 partnership agreement drawn up by a real attorney, and poured my entire pension into the renovation. We opened Flower Child Patisserie on a crisp October morning, the air smelling of butter and caramelized sugar. Michael created, Vanessa managed the books with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and I handled compliance, payroll, health department paperwork, and the occasional Saturday shift behind the counter, where I learned to tell a perfect lamination by the sound of a knife slicing through it. For 3 years it worked. Then Michael died. A massive heart attack at 54, right in the middle of piping delicate buttercream roses onto a 4-tier wedding cake. He collapsed on the stainless steel prep table, the piping bag still clutched in his hand, and the world went grey. The funeral was a blur of organ music and people saying he was too young. Vanessa wore a perfectly tailored black dress and wept with the dramatic intensity of a soap opera actress, clutching a handkerchief she never actually used. Within 24 hours of the burial, the vultures circled. She arrived at my condo not alone. She brought Derek, a man I'd never met, with bleached teeth and a handshake that lingered too long, calling everyone chief. She introduced him as her fiancé, though I hadn't even known she was dating. They both wore the soft, pitying expressions of people about to manage a problem. "We're here to help you through this, sweetie," Vanessa said, patting my hand with icy fingers. "The bakery needs quick decisions, and you're clearly too overwhelmed to make them." Derek nodded, already scanning my living room like he was appraising the furniture for a quick estate sale. They began going through Michael's things, boxing up his life with a brisk efficiency that made my stomach turn. I was too numb to stop them, just sat on the couch watching them categorize my brother's existence into keep and donate. That's when I saw her reach for the recipe tin. It was a vintage aluminum box, dented from decades of use, the kind with a red Bakelite lid that had belonged to our grandmother. Michael had filled it with his original recipe cards, the stained, handwritten blueprints of his life's work, everything from his laminated brioche to his secret croissant butter block ratios. Vanessa lifted the lid, flipped through a few cards with a dismissive smirk, and said, "Old junk, we'll need to modernize with digital scales and standardized recipes. This is just clutter." She tossed the entire tin into a cardboard box marked for Goodwill. Something in me flickered, a tiny spark in the dense fog of grief. After they left, I retrieved the tin. I sat on my kitchen floor in the kind of hollowed-out sorrow that makes breathing feel like a conscious decision, and I opened it. The recipes were there, flour-stained and annotated in Michael's left-handed scrawl. But as I lifted the bottom layer of cards, my fingers found a yellowed envelope taped to the very bottom. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper, the kind Michael used for his menu drafts. His handwriting was shaky, written in haste. The note read, "If you're reading this, I'm gone. Do not trust Vanessa. She's been planning something for months. The original ledger is your proof. I've hidden it in the bakery's walk-in freezer behind the butter supply. Everything you need is in the ink, "Save yourself, I love you." I read the words a dozen times, my vision blurring, my heart turning from a raw wound into a hard, cold stone. My brother had known. He had seen the betrayal coming, maybe sensed it in the way Vanessa looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching, and he had left me a trail of breadcrumbs, literal breadcrumbs from beyond the grave. I tucked the note into my bra, the paper a sharp square against my ribs, and I stood up. The fog of grief began to lift, replaced by a furious, calculating clarity. I was not going to be a victim. I was going to be a problem. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that family isn't an excuse for exploitation, and that the quietest person in the room is often the one you should fear the most. Over the next week, Vanessa and Derek escalated what they called their care campaign. They presented me with a thick sheaf of documents, printed on heavy bond paper with a notary seal already affixed. Vanessa explained, her voice dripping with synthetic sympathy, that I needed to sign over the business interests so she could save the bakery from creditors. Derek added, leaning in with a conspiratorial whisper, that Michael had left a staggering amount of debt, a pile of unpaid invoices and a balloon payment on the equipment loan, and the only way to protect me from personal liability was to transfer everything to Vanessa's name. They'd give me a generous severance package to cover my living expenses. I looked at the figure typed into the agreement, $3,000. A single final payment in exchange for my entire $130,000 investment, my intellectual property rights, my 50% ownership, and any future income. And as a cruel theatrical flourish, Vanessa produced a small bakery box tied with a ribbon and said, "We even baked you a severance scone, sweetie, because you loved the orange cranberry one so much." A scone, a $3 scone as a parting gift for my life savings. I could have shattered. I didn't. I smiled, let my eyes go glassy and unfocused, and I told them I was just too sad to think clearly, that I needed a few days to process the paperwork. I poured myself a glass of water with trembling hands, playing the broken older woman left adrift by loss, the woman whose world had shrunk to a box of tissues and daytime television. They bought it completely. They bought it because they were arrogant, and they assumed my grey hair and soft voice meant I was feeble. That was their first catastrophic mistake. They moved me into their guest house, a sleek modern cube behind their sprawling suburban home, so we can keep an eye on you and make sure you're eating. In reality, it was a control tactic, an isolation chamber where they could monitor my movements and limit my contact with the outside world. I packed a small bag, and I made sure it included the recipe tin, my own meticulous nursing journals from decades of continuing education seminars, CPR recertifications and mandatory compliance courses, and a small magnifying glass I found in a desk drawer, a relic from Derek's brief and abandoned hobby as a stamp collector. That tiny magnifying glass, a cheap plastic loupe with a built-in light, would become my primary forensic tool. The guest house was comfortable but acoustically transparent. The heating vents connected directly to the main house's kitchen, and sound traveled through them with crystal clarity. I quickly realized that Vanessa spent hours on the phone in that kitchen, thinking she was alone. I would sit on the guest house floor, my ear inches from the vent, and I'd listen. I heard her arguing with suppliers. "I told you the check is in the mail, just wait another week." I heard Derek on his cell pacing the driveway, talking to someone named Rich about unloading the IP quickly before anyone starts asking questions. He used phrases like clean exit and non-recourse advance, and the buyer needs a clear title by the end of the quarter. I began keeping a log in a small pocket notebook, a habit from my nursing days when every medication administration required a signature, a time, and a witness. I noted dates, times, and verbatim snippets of conversation. I also retrieved the guesthouse's recycling bin. Inside, I found a series of past due notices for the bakery's flour supplier, a final warning from the commercial landlord threatening eviction, and a bank statement showing a $140,000 loan taken out against the bakery's equipment, a loan I had never signed for. My signature was on the loan document, but the moment I looked at it under my magnifying glass, I knew it was a forgery. The strokes were hesitant, the pressure uneven, the loops too perfect. It was a trace-over, a copy that tried too hard to mimic my confident, practiced scrawl and ended up looking mechanical, like a robot trying to imitate a human heartbeat. Life in the guest house was a masterclass in passive surveillance. I was 5'2", grey-haired, and I moved like a ghost in soft-soled shoes. They quickly forgot I had ears that had spent decades picking up the subtle beep of a malfunctioning Roman IV pump from across a recovery ward, eyes that could spot a single misplaced sponge on a surgical tray from 10 feet away. 5 days into my stay, a critical thing happened. A pipe burst under the kitchen sink in the main house. Water was cascading onto their imported Italian tile, and Derek was flailing with a roll of duct tape, screaming at Vanessa to call a plumber. I walked in, assessed the situation in a heartbeat, and calmly turned off the hot water valve with a quarter turn of my wrist. Then I fetched the adjustable wrench I'd kept in my bag, a relic from my years of maintaining portable surgical units and fixing stuck autoclaves. I had the pipe disassembled, the worn rubber gasket identified, and a temporary patch installed in under 20 minutes. I wiped my greasy hands on a rag and said, "Sometimes the old girl still has a few tricks." The look on Derek's face was priceless, a mix of humiliation and grudging respect. That single act of quiet competence bought me a sliver of trust. They began to see me as a harmless, handy old nurse, not a threat. That meant I could move around the house more freely, and they stopped locking every door, which led me to the shredder. In Derek's home office, a sleek glass-walled room I'd never been allowed into, I had noticed a heavy-duty cross-cut shredder with a bin overflowing with confetti. The confetti was always fresh, which meant they were destroying something daily. One afternoon, while they were at what Vanessa called a meeting with a potential investor, which I later learned was the Sweet Rise corporate office, I decided to explore. The office door was locked with a cheap desk-style lock. Now, lockpicking isn't a standard nursing skill, but I spent my career around anesthesiologists who guarded their drug carts with more paranoia than Fort Knox. One of them, Dr. Levine, had been a competitive lockpicker in his youth and taught me the basics as a party trick decades ago. He showed me how to use a tension wrench to apply rotational pressure and a rake to manipulate the pins. I never thought I'd use the skill outside of a holiday party, but I had kept a small kit in my bag, just a few barbie pins and a filed-down wiper blade insert I'd shaped into a tension wrench while maintaining my car. I crouched by the door, inserted the tension wrench, and gently raked the pins with a barbie pin. The lock surrendered in under 40 seconds with a soft click. Inside the office, I hit the motherlode. The first file folder was labeled Bakery Dissolution. Inside was a document dated 6 weeks before Michael's death, purporting to dissolve our partnership and transfer my 50% stake to Vanessa for a sum of $3,000. My signature was on the line, looking unnervingly like mine, but the date was circled in red. I pulled out my nursing journal from that exact date. I was 300 miles away at a pediatric advanced life support certification course in Chicago. I had the attendance certificate, the course agenda, and a hotel receipt with a timestamp. I couldn't have been in Milwaukee to sign anything. Then I checked the original bakery ledger, which I hadn't yet retrieved. Wait, no, I retrieved that later. Let me reorder. I had already gone to the bakery and retrieved the ledger by then. Let me realign the timeline. Actually, the draft had her retrieve the ledger after the pipe burst and before the shredder. I'll keep that order. She goes to the bakery, retrieves the ledger, then later the shredder discovery, so I'll build that. The day after the pipe incident, while Vanessa and Derek were out at a meeting, I walked to the bakery. The space was dark and silent, a foreclosure notice taped to the front door. My key still worked. The air inside was stale, the flour bins empty, the marble countertops layered in dust. I went straight to the walk-in freezer, a tiny Arctic room lined with stainless steel shelves, the compressor humming a low dirge. Behind a 50-pound block of plug raw butter, tucked into a plastic-wrapped package, I found a cardboard accordion folder exactly where Michael's note promised. Inside was the original bakery ledger. This was no ordinary accounting book. It was a thick cloth-bound volume, the kind used in old-timey general stores, and Michael had filled it with an almost obsessive level of detail. Every single day he recorded the temperature and humidity outside because that affects pastry dough performance. He noted the brand of flour used for each batch, the batch number, the behavior of his sourdough starter that he'd nicknamed Bready Mercury, and the exact gram weight of each finished product. Next to each entry, in a different colored ink, Vanessa had recorded the financial transactions for the day, the deposits, the expenditures, the cash flow. And then, at the bottom of each page, I had signed off on payroll and compliance checks, my signature a confident, looping scrawl in black ink. The ledger was a time capsule, a forensic document of staggering precision, a daily diary of the bakery's life that cross-referenced every physical ingredient with every financial transaction. It was, as I would later learn, an evidentiary atom bomb. Armed with the ledger, I returned to the guest house and began cross-referencing. I noted that on the date of the supposed dissolution signing, Michael's entry described a complex croissant lamination that required exactly 93% humidity, a note about the butter shattering because the walk-in was too cold, and my own signature approving a payroll adjustment for a part-time baker who called in sick. That bakery was my alibi. The ink on the ledger was embedded with flour dust. The dissolution document was pristine and sterile. I also pulled out a bank statement I'd salvaged from the recycling bin, and I noticed a wire transfer of $620,000 scheduled to go to a holding company called Sweet Rise Acquisitions LLC upon clear title. The pieces started clicking. Vanessa needed to eliminate me as an owner to sell the entire intellectual property, the trademark, the recipes, and the lease to a national chain. Later that week, I finally accessed Derek's office and found the shredder. I had already picked the lock. Inside the file folder, bakery dissolution held the forged document. It was thorough, my signature, a notary stamp, and a witness line signed by someone I'd never heard of. Under my magnifying glass, the signature was a traceover. I could see faint pencil guidelines beneath the ink, the telltale sign of a forger who lacked confidence. The notary stamp had a serial number. This was critical. The next day I used a burner phone I'd purchased from a gas station, a cheap flip phone that couldn't be traced, and I called the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions. I posed as a loan officer named Janet from a small credit union, verifying a notarization on a commercial deed. I gave the serial number. The clerk on the line, a helpful young woman named Tiffany, told me that notary commission had expired 18 months earlier, and the notary herself, a woman named Esther Park, had been deceased for over a year. A dead notary. Vanessa had used a stamp from a dead woman. I could barely contain my grin. I then explored further into Derek's file cabinet. I found a uniform commercial code filing that granted Derek a security interest in the bakery's fixtures, a document I had never seen, and a trademark assignment document transferring the Flower Child Patisserie name and logo to Sweet Rise Acquisitions LLC. In the back of the file, I found the purchase agreement. Sweet Rise was offering $620,000 for the complete intellectual property portfolio, contingent on Vanessa being the sole legal owner. There was a wire transfer instruction sheet with Derek's personal account number at an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands. They weren't just stealing my bakery. They were laundering the proceeds through international shell accounts, which elevated this from a civil dispute to a federal crime. Wire fraud, forgery, identity theft, crossing state lines. I photographed every single page with my smartphone, making sure to capture bank routing numbers, account details, and all signatures. I replaced the files exactly as I found them, and I relocked the desk. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From a fury so pure and so cold it felt almost serene. I needed a professional ally. Michael had mentioned a lawyer friend, Elaine, years ago in passing, a woman who had helped him navigate a trademark dispute early on. I found her through the state bar's directory. Elaine was a white-collar criminal defense attorney turned victim advocate, a sharp woman in her 60s with a cascade of silver hair and a collection of statement necklaces that clattered when she talked. I met her in her downtown office, and I laid out my evidence on her polished walnut conference table. The photos of the forged documents, the burner phone confirmation of the dead notary, my nursing journal entries from the date of the forgery, the bakery ledger with cross-referencing daily entries, and the offshore account information. Elaine paged through the materials in silence, her reading glasses perched on her nose. Then she did something unexpected. She laughed, a deep, delighted sound. "Your brother was a clever, clever man," she said. She explained that the ledger itself was a legal marvel. It wasn't just a book. It was a contemporaneous business record with multiple cross-referencing entries that would be admissible in federal court under the business records exception to the hearsay rule. The fact that Vanessa had co-signed daily financial entries alongside my inventory checks created a chain of custody that made the forged dissolution document physically impossible to reconcile. The dates, the ink colors, the flour dust embedded in the pages, it all told a story that a single forged document could not overwrite. But Elaine had more. She told me that 6 months earlier, she had been contacted by a compliance officer at First Wisconsin Bank, where Michael held the bakery's operating accounts. My brother had been worried about the business's future if something happened to him, so he had placed a dead man's switch on the commercial line of credit. He'd instructed the bank that upon his death, all asset transfers from the business accounts would require the personal presence of his sister, me, with 2 forms of government ID and a thumbprint scan. Michael hadn't told Vanessa about this failsafe, so for weeks the bank had been stonewalling Vanessa's desperate attempts to access the line of credit and clear the encumbrance that was holding up the Sweet Rise sale. That's why she was so frantic to get my signature. Not just to take my ownership, but to unlock the frozen account so she could finally get the $620,000 payout. The trap was already set, a tripwire from beyond the grave, and I just had to walk into it at the right moment, with the right people watching. Elaine brought in a forensic accountant named Patricia, a woman who wore severe buns and spoke in rapid-fire sentences about ink chemistry and paper fiber analysis. Patricia examined the dissolution document under a digital video microscope. She found that the ink on the forged signature was a gel pen manufactured by a company that didn't release that particular formulation until 6 months after the supposed signing date. The paper itself was acid-free archival stock, a type that wasn't used in standard legal documents in Wisconsin until the following year. She compiled a 20-page report, complete with microscopic photographs and chemical timelines that would later make the prosecution's case airtight. Elaine then connected me with Agent Silvers from the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force. Silvers was a calm, tired-eyed man in a rumpled suit who listened to my story while clicking a pen in a rhythmic pattern. He asked if I'd be willing to wear a recording device and get Vanessa to admit to the forgery on tape. We need her to say it out loud to acknowledge that she forged your signature and that she knows the dissolution is fraudulent, he said. Can you steer a conversation there? I nodded. I'd spent a lifetime making anxious patients comfortable enough to confess their worst fears before surgery. With people like Vanessa, ego was always the weak point. Agent Silvers and a tech named Ramirez fitted me with a small buttonhole transmitter, the microphone disguised as the top button of my cardigan, the battery pack taped flat against my ribs with medical adhesive, a trick I knew well. We rehearsed the verbal triggers. I would pretend to be confused about the dates, mention that I was at a conference that day, and then ask Vanessa how she had managed to get the signature so perfect. We hoped her pride would make her boast. With people like Vanessa, ego always wins. Before the final confrontation, I needed to test the depth of their depravity, to extinguish any residual family loyalty I might still feel. I staged a medical emergency. As a nurse, I knew exactly how to fake a hypoglycemic episode. Hypoglycemia presents with confusion, sweating, tremors, and slurred speech, and I had seen it dozens of times in diabetic patients whose blood sugar crashed after surgery. I deliberately skipped breakfast, took a brisk morning walk in the sun to burn off my residual glucose, and then, just as Vanessa was entering the kitchen, I let my body go. I stumbled, my knees buckling, my hand knocking a coffee mug off the counter so it shattered dramatically. I had splashed water on my face beforehand to mimic the cold, clammy sweat of diaphoresis. I hit the tile floor, my eyes fluttering, and I slurred my words in the classic fragmented pattern. Vanessa. Sugar. Need juice, can't see straight. I held out a trembling hand, my breathing shallow and rapid. She froze. For 5 full seconds she stared at me, her eyes cold and calculating, not a flicker of maternal instinct, not a twitch of concern. Then she stepped directly over my outstretched arm. Her heel clicked within an inch of my fingers. She didn't go to the phone to call 911. She didn't even look at my face. She snatched the manila envelope I had dropped, the one containing the fake severance documents, and she said to Derek, who had appeared in the doorway with a half-eaten bagel, "Finally. Get her signature on the release form before she comes to." That was it. The last frayed thread of familial obligation inside me snapped. I lay there on the cold tile, a woman they thought was dying, and they walked over me to get to a signature. I recovered a minute later, blinking and apologizing, accepting a glass of water from a suddenly solicitous Vanessa who stroked my hair and said, "You scared us, sweetie." I smiled weakly, but inside the temperature had dropped to absolute zero. I had every ounce of evidence I needed to destroy them, and not a single shred of guilt remained. The takedown was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at the downtown branch of First Wisconsin Bank. Vanessa had told me we were going to finalize a small paperwork issue, so she could release some funds for my ongoing care. In reality, she needed me to appear in person, provide my driver's license and passport, and place my thumbprint on a scanner to unlock Michael's dead man's switch, so the funds could flow and the Sweet Rise sale could close. Derek drove, chattering about golf. I sat in the back seat, the wire transmitting from my cardigan button, my heart beating steady and slow. In the bank's private conference room, a sleek table of polished walnut sat Mr. Hartley, the Sweet Rise corporate lawyer, a notary public, and a bank officer named M.S. Chen. Vanessa pushed a stack of crisp documents toward me, their tabs neatly flagged with bright yellow stickers. "Just sign where the little flags are, sweetie. This is all going to be over soon, and you won't have to worry about any of that nasty legal stuff anymore." Her smile was tight, a mask stretched thin. I picked up the heavy Mont Blanc pen she had placed in front of me, weighed it in my hand for a long moment, and then set it down with a soft click. I'm not signing anything that gives you permission to steal my brother's legacy, Vanessa. Her smile vanished. Her eyes went flat and dangerous. What are you talking about? We've been through this. You're confused again. Your grief is making you paranoid. Her voice dripped with practiced condescension, the tone she used on waiters and service workers. I looked her dead in the eye, and I let the steel that had been forming in my spine for weeks shine through. No, I'm not confused. I'm a retired surgical nurse with 34 years of experience reading charts, counting instruments, and spotting the one detail out of 100 that doesn't belong. I can tell the difference between real ink and a trace over. I know that the notary on your dissolution document, Esther Park, died a year before she could have stamped it. I know that the date on the signature is a day I was 300 miles away at a pediatric life support certification in Chicago, and the bakery's original ledger puts me in the walk-in freezer counting butter that same evening. I slid a photocopy of the ledger page across the table, the page where Michael's handwriting noted the humidity and my handwriting approved a payroll change. Every gram of butter accounted for in my own ink, on paper that still has flour dust in its fibers. You forged my name on a document that can't exist in the same timeline as this book. Vanessa's face went parchment white. Derek started to bluster. This is ridiculous. She's clearly mentally unfit. We should reschedule. But I pressed on. Just one question, Vanessa. How did you get my signature so perfect? I mean, it's almost indistinguishable. You must have practiced for a long time. She hesitated, her jaw working, but ego is a leaky faucet. She smirked, the mask slipping, and she leaned forward as if sharing a secret. I copied it from the original partnership agreement, you idiot. I traced it onto vellum and then practiced for weeks until I could do it in my sleep. Do you have any idea how much money is on the line? $620,000. You were supposed to be the silent investor, the doting sister who wrote checks and stayed in the background, not an obstacle. That was the admission. The transmitter caught every syllable, every smug inflection, and the FBI van parked across the street recorded it onto a hard drive. I smiled at her, a real, genuine smile, and I said simply, "Thank you." The conference room door opened. In walked Agent Silvers and 2 uniformed officers. Silvers held up his badge, the gold shield catching the light. "Vanessa Merck, Derek Shaw, you're under arrest for wire fraud, forgery, and identity theft. You have the right to remain silent." Vanessa lunged for the documents, trying to grab the stack and rip them, but an officer intercepted her arm. Her composure shattered into a screeching, profanity-laced tirade. "You can't do this. She's a crazy old woman. This is entrapment." Derek tried to edge toward the fire exit, but found it blocked by the bank's security guard, a large man with crossed arms. I stood up, smoothing my cardigan, and I said, "You underestimated a nurse who spent a lifetime noticing the tiniest detail out of place. A single suture left in a body can kill someone. A single date on a ledger can put someone in prison. You never stood a chance." As they were led out in handcuffs, I turned to the stunned Sweet Rye's lawyer, Mr. Hartley, who was sweating through his expensive shirt. "The intellectual property is mine. The sale is void. If your company wants to negotiate a licensing deal for the recipes, you can contact my lawyer, Elaine Petrakis, but the trademark and the name are not for sale." He just nodded, snapping his briefcase shut with trembling fingers. The legal aftermath was swift and brutal, partly because the evidence trail was so meticulously documented that the prosecution barely had to work. The forensic accountant's report on ink chemistry and paper dating, the original ledger with daily cross-referenced entries, the wiretap recording where Vanessa bragged about tracing my signature, and the dead man's switch documentation from the bank formed an airtight case. Vanessa was convicted on 3 counts of forgery, 1 count of wire fraud and identity theft. She was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, but the judge, a woman named Honorable Clara Reyes, who had clearly dealt with enough white-collar sociopaths to be utterly unsympathetic, added a creative twist to the restitution order. Vanessa was required to repay every cent of the $3,000 severance with compound interest, cover my legal fees, and fund the restoration of the bakery's equipment. But because she had hidden most of her liquid assets in untouchable foreign accounts, the court imposed a long-term garnishment on any future wages she earned while out on parole. Derek, who had a prior fraud charge from a used car scheme, got 8 years. Sweet Rye's, facing a public relations disaster and potential charges of conspiracy, quietly settled out of court for an undisclosed sum and even paid a licensing fee for one of the laminated brioche recipes they had already leaked to their test kitchens. I used that money to fully renovate the patisserie, upgrade the ovens, and rebrand. I reopened under a name that makes me grin every time I see it on the window: Flour Power Revenge Bakery. The grand opening featured a special pastry called the Fraud Scone, a perfect buttery scone with a tangy lemon curd filling, because the best revenge is not just sweet but also a little sour. The line stretched around the block, and the local news ran a segment titled "The Scone That Toppled a Conspiracy." And here's the part that still makes me smile on my darkest days: the cherry on top of this multi-layered cake. The court ordered Vanessa, as a condition of her parole and community service, to complete 100 hours of supervised work as a dishwasher at my bakery. Every Saturday morning, a corrections van drops her off at the back entrance. She puts on an apron, one I had specially embroidered with the words "Icing on the Fraud" in heart pink thread, and she scrubs sheet pans, mixing bowls, and piping tips under the supervision of my head baker, a fierce young woman named Rosa who takes no nonsense. She is not allowed to speak to customers or touch any money. Her hourly wage, $7.25, is automatically garnished by the court and issued as a check payable to the Women's Legal Aid Fund, a non-profit that provides pro bono legal representation to women fighting financial fraud and domestic exploitation. Every single dollar buys pastries for their fundraising events. Last month, the garnishment check funded 2,000 miniature petit fours for a conference on elder financial abuse. I stood behind the counter, polishing the espresso machine, and through the pass-through window I watched Vanessa, her hairnet askew, her hands red and raw from industrial detergent. She caught my eye once, and the hatred there was a real, physical thing, a blast of pure venom. I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast and mouthed the words, "Thanks for the recipe." She turned away, and I heard Rosa order her to rescrub a sheet pan that still had a speck of caramel. I think about Michael often now. About the note he taped inside that dented old tin, the careful, loving way he documented every pinch of yeast and every fluctuation of humidity. He knew his wife's heart better than anyone, and he saw the betrayal coming long before I did. His final gift was a roadmap out of a trap I hadn't even seen closing, a paper trail buried in frozen butter. I like to think he'd appreciate the irony. The bakery he loved now stands as a testament to the fact that loyalty isn't about DNA or marriage licenses. It's about who shows up for you with flour-dusted hands and a ledger of truth. And if someone decides to poison the well, a smart woman doesn't just drain it. She opens a bakery and serves them justice, one flaky, laminated, perfectly buttery pastry at a time. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Tell me in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell for more tales of ordinary people who use their quiet skills to turn the tables on the ones who underestimated them. Remember, the truth is always in the details, and sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you need to watch. I'll see you in the next one.